Why you mistake stability for truth. Sometimes you do not trust a thought because it is true. You trust it because it makes you feel stable. It gives the mind a place to stand. It reduces movement. It quiets uncertainty. It makes the inner world feel less exposed. And because of that, the thought begins to feel reliable. Not because it has been fully examined, because it helps something inside you stop shifting. This is where the mistake begins. The mind starts confusing the feeling of stability with the presence of truth. It says, "This feels solid, so it must be right." But solid does not always mean true. Sometimes it only means the system has found a shape it can hold, a conclusion that lowers pressure, a meaning that gives structure, a story that keeps the situation from feeling too open. And once the mind feels that structure, it begins to trust it. Not because it sees more, because it shakes less. That is the hidden movement. The mind can prefer what feels stable before it ever asks whether what feels stable is actually complete. This is why stability can feel so persuasive. It does not need to prove anything immediately. It only needs to make the system feel less divided, less pulled, less uncertain, less open to too many directions. And once that happens, the mind begins to relax around the thought. The thought feels heavier, more grounded, more dependable. So the mind assumes, if this makes me feel stable, it must be closer to reality. But sometimes the thought is not closer to reality. It is closer to what the system can tolerate. That is the difference. Truth may be unstable at first. It may create movement. It may ask for patience. It may make the situation less simple before it becomes clear. But the mind does not always want that. It wants something it can stand on now, something that stops the shaking, something that gives form to the inner uncertainty. And if a thought can do that, the mind may begin to treat it as if it were true before it has actually allowed the truth to unfold. This is why some beliefs become difficult to question. They are not only beliefs, they are structures. They hold the mind in a certain position. They make the inner world feel organized. They reduce the feeling that everything could move in too many directions at once. And because of that, the mind begins to depend on them, not only to understand, to remain steady. So when a belief is touched, the mind does not feel only intellectual doubt. It feels instability. The ground shifts. The familiar shape weakens. The old explanation no longer holds everything as tightly as before. And this can feel like danger. Not because the new possibility is false, but because it makes the system less settled. This is where the confusion deepens. The mind starts protecting what keeps it stable, and then calls that protection truth. It says, "I know this is right." But sometimes what it really means is, "I do not want to lose the only shape that makes this feel manageable." This is why stability can make an incomplete truth feel complete. The mind feels less movement, less uncertainty, less inner noise, less pressure to keep searching. And because everything feels more settled, it assumes the process is finished. But sometimes what finished was not the seeing, only the shaking. The thought gave you enough structure to feel less exposed. It gave the experience a frame. It made the open space smaller. And once the open space became smaller, the mind began to trust the frame. This is the quiet mistake. You stop asking, "Is this fully true?" And you begin asking, "Does this keep me steady?" That question is not always conscious.
but it can guide the whole process. The mind leans toward the version of reality that creates the least movement, the version that keeps the system organized, the version that allows you to say, "At least now, I know where I stand." But knowing where you stand is not always the same as knowing what is true. Sometimes it only means you found a place that stopped the ground from moving.
This is why some truths are rejected before they are understood. Not because they are false, because they disturb the structure the mind is using to stay steady. A new possibility appears, and immediately the system feels movement. The old certainty loosens. The familiar explanation loses some weight. The inner position becomes less fixed. And instead of noticing this as movement, the mind may interpret it as danger. It says, "This cannot be right. This makes no sense. This only creates confusion. I was clearer before." But sometimes you were not clearer before. You were only more stable. And stability can feel like clarity because it removes the discomfort of not knowing. That is the trap. The mind may prefer a stable mistake to an unstable truth, because the stable mistake gives it something to hold, while the unstable truth asks it to remain open before the new shape has formed. And remaining open can feel unbearable to a mind that has learned to trust only what does not move. This is why the mind often resists the phase where truth has not yet become stable. That phase feels exposed. The old structure has been questioned, but the new understanding has not arrived yet. So there is a gap, and in that gap, the mind feels vulnerable. It wants to go back to the thought that made things solid. It wants the familiar shape, the familiar explanation, the familiar certainty that kept the system from moving too much. But sometimes that gap is not a sign that you are losing clarity. It is the place where deeper clarity has not formed yet. The mind mistakes that instability for being wrong. It says, "If this were true, I would feel more certain." But that is not always true. Sometimes truth begins by making you less certain, less fixed, less able to use the old structure as a place to hide. And if the mind cannot tolerate that movement, it will return to the stable answer, not because it is truer, but because it feels safer than staying open while something deeper is still forming. This is why real clarity often feels unstable before it feels true. It has to loosen the structure that was holding you. It has to make space where the mind wanted certainty. It has to interrupt the familiar shape long enough for something more honest to appear. But the mind does not always recognize this as part of seeing. It feels the movement and thinks, "This is wrong. This is too uncertain. This is making me less clear." So it returns to what feels stable, the old thought, the old meaning, the old position that made the inner world feel organized. And once it returns, the relief can feel like proof. The mind says, "Now I feel steady again, so this must be the truth." But sometimes that steadiness is only the return to a familiar structure, not the arrival of deeper understanding. This is the pattern to notice. The mind does not only seek truth, it seeks something that allows it to stop moving. And when stopping movement feels like truth, stability becomes the thing you trust more than what is actually seen. Once this is seen, stability becomes less absolute. It can still be useful. It can still give the mind a place to rest, but it no longer has to be mistaken for truth. You can feel when something makes you steady without immediately assuming that steadiness means the seeing is complete. You can notice the thought that gives structure and still ask whether the structure is wide enough to hold what is real. This is where the pattern begins to weaken. Not when the mind stops wanting stability, but when stability no longer decides what you are allowed to call true. Because sometimes
truth does not arrive as a solid ground. Sometimes it arrives as movement, as openness, as the loss of a familiar shape before a deeper one has formed. And if you can stay there without running back to the first thing that makes you feel stable, clarity has more room to appear. This is inner cognition.